A school janitor protected a lost child during the rain. He didn't know the child's mother was a famous CEO. The yellow raincoat caught Caleb Morgan's eye first. A small bright smear against the gray afternoon, moving fast along the edge of the school grounds where no child should have been walking alone. By the time he registered what he was looking at, the raincoat had already slipped through the side gate and disappeared down the block, swallowed by sheets of rain that had turned from drizzle to storm in the span of a single hour. Caleb didn't stop to think. He dropped the mop he'd been pushing across the kindergarten hallway, grabbed his own jacket off the hook by the maintenance closet, and ran out into the downpour after a 5-year-old he barely knew. The storm had come in fast that afternoon, the kind of sudden downpour that turned gutters into rivers within minutes. Somewhere behind him he could hear a teacher's aide calling out, voice thin against the wind. But he didn't slow down long enough to answer. 33 years of paying attention to small, quiet things had taught him that seconds mattered more than explanations. He'd sort out the how and why later. Right now, there was only the fading flash of yellow disappearing into gray. He found her 3 blocks away, huddled beneath the narrow overhang of an abandoned bus shelter, soaked around the edges of her raincoat, clutching a small backpack against her chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Thunder cracked somewhere overhead, and the little girl flinched hard enough that Caleb saw it from 20 feet away. He didn't run toward her. He'd learned, somewhere over 33 years of paying close attention to the world, that frightened children needed space before they needed rescue. He crouched down several feet away instead, letting the rain soak straight through his own thin work shirt. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "I'm Caleb. I work at your school. You don't have to come with me until you're ready." Then, in a small voice barely audible over the storm, she whispered, "Mommy is coming." Caleb didn't tell her she was wrong. He simply nodded, settling onto the wet curb beside the shelter, close enough to offer comfort, far enough not to crowd her. "Then we'll wait somewhere safe for her," he said. He shrugged off his own rain jacket and wrapped it carefully around her shoulders, the fabric far too big, swallowing her small frame entirely. When her shivering didn't ease after a few minutes, he made a decision. "I'm going to carry you back toward the school now, okay? Somewhere warm and dry. We'll leave a note for your mom so she knows exactly where to find you." Lily studied him a long moment, rain dripping off her nose, before finally nodding. "Do you promise?" she asked, small and solemn, the kind of question only a child can ask with that much weight behind it. "I promise," Caleb said, and meant it the way he meant every promise he ever made, which was completely. Caleb lifted her carefully, tucking an old plastic maintenance cover over both their heads as makeshift shelter, and began the walk back. Halfway there, Lily's small voice broke the silence between them. "Are you the man who fixes the broken things?" Caleb laughed despite himself, surprised. "Sometimes." She looked at him with sudden, serious focus, entirely unbothered by the rain still hammering down around them. "Can you fix my umbrella? The handle broke." "I can try," Caleb promised. "Everybody says things are broken, and then they just throw them away," Lily said, matter of fact, the way children deliver their biggest truths, almost as an afterthought. "My nanny threw away my music box because the song stopped working." Caleb was quiet a moment, adjusting his grip on her as they turned the corner toward the school. "Well," he said finally, "I don't believe in throwing things away just because the song stopped. Sometimes, you just have to figure out what's stuck." Lily seemed to consider this a satisfactory answer, and rested her head against his shoulder for the rest of the walk. By the time they reached the school, the office staff had already begun frantically searching the building, phones ringing, teachers calling Lily's name down empty hallways. Caleb carried her straight to the front entrance, and the moment they stepped through the doors, relief rippled visibly through the small group of adults gathered there. He didn't hand her off immediately. He carried her to the maintenance room instead, wrapped her in a dry sweater pulled from the lost and found bin, made her a cup of warm cocoa from the small hot plate he kept for cold winter shifts, and sat down across from her, with her broken umbrella and a spare piece of plastic tubing from his supply cart. Lily watched him work with total fascination, her earlier fear entirely forgotten, replaced by the particular focused wonder small children bring to anything that looks like magic. "Do you make videos?" she asked suddenly. Caleb glanced up, genuinely surprised. "How do you know about that?" "My teacher showed us one. You fixed an old chair, and it looked brand new." Lily leaned forward, studying the umbrella repair with total absorption. "I liked it." Caleb smiled, something warm settling into his chest that had nothing to do with the cocoa steaming between them. "I don't make them to become famous," he admitted, mostly to himself. "I just like showing people that broken things aren't always useless." Lily considered this with the particular seriousness only 5-year-olds seem capable of summoning for the biggest ideas. "Maybe people can be broken too," she said quietly. The words caught Caleb entirely off guard. He looked at this small, soaked girl sitting across from him, working through some private grief he couldn't quite name, and understood, with sudden clarity, that she carried a kind of loneliness far heavier than any 5-year-old should have to shoulder. "Yeah," he said finally, voice gentler than before, "I think maybe they can." He didn't press her further. He'd learned that too, somewhere along the way, that children, like broken furniture, revealed themselves slowly, in their own time, and that pushing too hard only ever cracks something that might have healed on its own. Victoria Carter arrived at the school 15 minutes later, umbrella forgotten in her rush from the car, soaked through and visibly panicked the moment the receptionist told her Lily had gone missing during the storm. 32 years old, the celebrated CEO of one of the country's fastest-growing children's technology companies, Victoria had built an entire career on staying composed under pressure. None of that composure survived the words, "We can't find her." She'd been trapped in an emergency board meeting when her assistant called the school, assured everyone Victoria was on her way, watched the meeting stretch 45 minutes longer than promised, while somewhere across the city, her daughter waited alone in a storm. She'd driven through the rain with her knuckles white on the steering wheel, replaying every version of what might have happened, unable to forgive herself for a single one of them. Every red light on the drive over had felt like a small cruelty. She remembered gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles ached, running through a list of names she could call, people she could send, and understanding somewhere beneath the panic that none of it would matter if she wasn't the one who showed up. She was searching the school grounds with 2 members of security when Caleb walked through the entrance, carrying Lily against his hip. Victoria ran toward them without a single coherent thought in her head, gathering Lily into her arms so tightly the little girl let out a small, surprised laugh. "Mommy, you're squishing me." Victoria didn't loosen her grip for several long seconds, face buried in her daughter's damp hair, breathing in the fact of her, safe and warm and entirely present. For a long moment she didn't even register the man standing quietly a few feet away. Then Lily pointed toward him. "He found me." Victoria looked up, finally taking in the full picture. Caleb's soaked work shirt clinging to his shoulders, his own rain jacket still wrapped around Lily, the small repaired umbrella clutched proudly in her daughter's hand. "Thank you," she said, voice cracking. Thank you. I don't even know your name." "Caleb," he said simply. She was scared. I didn't want her waiting alone. Victoria studied him a long moment, something complicated moving behind her exhausted eyes, before gathering Lily's things and thanking him 3 more times on her way out the door. She left that evening, believing the incident was over. She was wrong. The next morning, Lily asked her teacher whether Caleb would be working that day. Over the following weeks, small connections began forming between them, quiet and accumulating. Lily left tiny drawings beside his cleaning cart, crayon suns, wobbly stick figures, once an entire elaborate scene depicting, as far as Caleb could interpret it, himself repairing a castle. She presented him with a paper crown one afternoon, informing him with total seriousness that anyone who fixes things deserved to be a queen or a king. Caleb, in return, secretly repaired a broken wooden puzzle from her classroom that had sat forgotten in a supply closet for months. Lily started stopping by the library after school, specifically because she knew that was where his afternoon cleaning route took him. Some afternoons, she simply sat on an overturned bucket near his cart, swinging her legs and narrating whatever story currently occupied her, entirely unbothered by whether Caleb was listening closely or simply nodding along while he worked. He always listened closely. It became, without either of them naming it, the best part of both their days. Their friendship became a quiet, ordinary fixture of the school's daily rhythm. Victoria noticed, at first with simple gratitude. Then, gradually, with something closer to discomfort she couldn't quite name. She was accustomed to a particular kind of treatment, deference, careful politeness, people adjusting their behavior around her reputation before they'd even properly met her. Caleb did none of that. He didn't know about her wealth. He never asked about her company. He had no idea magazines called her one of the country's youngest self-made CEOs. To Caleb, she was simply Lily's mother, arriving each evening a little later than she meant to, apologizing every single time. One evening, staying later than usual to catch up on emails in her car, outside the school, Victoria noticed Caleb setting up a small camera near the side entrance, filming something with the same quiet focus he brought to everything. Curious despite herself, she looked him up that night. She found a modest channel, unpolished but genuinely engaging, filled with videos of broken furniture slowly restored to something beautiful. A school reading table, repaired plank by plank. An old rocking chair sanded and restained. A shattered ceramic lamp painstakingly reassembled. One recent video, showing him restore a damaged children's reading table using nothing but salvaged wood, had unexpectedly gone viral, racking up views far beyond his usual modest audience. Victoria watched several more videos late into the night, increasingly fascinated. Caleb wasn't simply a janitor filling spare hours with a hobby. He had genuine, undeniable creative talent, patient and precise, the kind of eye for restoration that couldn't be taught easily. There was no music, no dramatic narration, nothing performative about any of it. Just his steady hands and his low, unhurried voice explaining what he was doing and why, as though he were speaking to a curious child rather than an audience of strangers. She found herself oddly moved by how little he seemed to want from any of it. She learned through a brief conversation the next day that he deliberately kept his school position even as his channel slowly grew. He liked the work, he told her, and didn't want his content to become his entire identity. Victoria found herself thinking about that sentence longer than she expected to. The reveal, when it finally came, happened by accident. Caleb spotted Victoria's face on the cover of a business magazine displayed in the school's reception area, a feature story about the country's most influential young entrepreneurs. He looked at the magazine, then at Lily sitting nearby with a coloring book, then back at Victoria, who just walked in to collect her daughter. "You're that Victoria Carter?" Victoria offered an awkward, slightly embarrassed smile. "Unfortunately." Caleb laughed, genuinely amused rather than intimidated, and something in their friendship settled more comfortably after that, freed from the strange asymmetry of one person knowing something significant the other hadn't. Caleb still refused to treat her any differently. If anything, learning her actual status simply confirmed what he'd already sensed. That underneath the magazine covers and boardroom meetings, she was mostly just a tired, loving mother trying to hold too many things together at once. "You could have told me sooner," Caleb said, not unkindly. "I liked being just Lily's mom to somebody," Victoria admitted, "even for a little while." Caleb nodded slowly, as though that made more sense to him than anything a magazine cover ever could. Then a new complication arrived. Victoria's company was preparing to launch a major public campaign centered on children's education, and her public relations team wanted her positioned as the perfect image of a mother, successfully balancing empire and family. Victoria knew the image wasn't entirely true. She'd missed school events she'd promised to attend. She'd forgotten small commitments more than once. She'd very nearly missed her daughter entirely during a storm, saved only because a school janitor had chosen to run out into the rain after a stranger's child. She mentioned the campaign to Caleb one evening, half venting, half genuinely uncertain what to do about the growing gap between her public image and her private reality. Caleb didn't lecture her. He simply said quietly, "Lily doesn't need the CEO version of you." Victoria looked at him, something in her chest tightening. "Then what does she need?" "Her mom." The sentence stayed with Victoria long after she'd driven home that night, turning it over in her mind at every red light. She began making small, deliberate changes. She attended Lily's classroom reading day, sitting cross-legged on the carpet with the other parents, instead of sending a substitute nanny. She started turning her phone off entirely during dinner. No exceptions, no emergencies important enough to interrupt the hour. She learned, finally, which bedtime story Lily currently loved best, memorizing the particular voices Lily insisted each character required. She began asking about her daughter's actual day instead of simply confirming homework had been completed. Lily noticed the changes before Victoria fully trusted herself to believe they'd last. "You're here a lot now," Lily observed one evening, genuinely curious rather than accusing. "I am," Victoria agreed. "I plan on staying that way." Just as things seemed to be settling into a gentler rhythm, Caleb's channel suddenly attracted major attention. A media company reached out with a formal contract offer. Substantial money attached to significantly more creative control than Caleb currently held over his own work. Around the same time, Victoria's company offered to sponsor his educational restoration videos directly, resources and reach that could transform his modest channel overnight. Caleb hesitated on both fronts, uneasy about the second offer specifically. He didn't want his growing friendship with Victoria to blur into something transactional. Didn't want to wonder, even privately, whether any future success had come through her influence rather than his own work. Victoria understood immediately, without needing it fully explained. "Whatever you choose," she told him, "I want it to be because it's right for you. Not because you know me." Caleb ultimately turned down the larger media contract, unwilling to surrender creative control, and instead built a small independent studio of his own, continuing to work part-time at the school while slowly developing educational content specifically designed for children. Lily became his self-appointed creative assistant, helping choose color palettes with total confidence, assigning ridiculous names to each project, insisting firmly that every broken object deserved, in her words, one more chance. Caleb's modest studio eventually landed an opportunity to produce a short educational series for children, built around exactly the philosophy he'd practiced quietly for years. That broken things, examined patiently enough, usually still held value worth uncovering. The project found real, meaningful success, but the moment that mattered most arrived through something much smaller. Lily's school announced a community exhibition, inviting contributions from staff and students alike. Caleb built an installation entirely from discarded school materials: broken chairs, damaged bookshelves, forgotten toys, abandoned art supplies collected from storage closets nobody had cleaned out in years. Instead of hiding the damage in each piece, he transformed it into the centerpiece of the design, visible cracks and repairs displayed proudly rather than concealed. He called the installation "Still Worth Keeping." Lily stood beside it during the exhibition, practically vibrating with pride, explaining to anyone who'd listen exactly which pieces she'd helped choose colors for. Victoria watched from the crowd, and slowly, standing there among broken chairs transformed into something beautiful, she understood that the title described far more than old-school furniture. It described her daughter. It described Caleb. and in a way she hadn't expected to feel so directly, it described herself as well. During the exhibition, Lily presented Caleb with a small handmade plaque, carefully lettered in her own careful 5-year-old handwriting. To the man who found me in the rain. Caleb's composure broke completely, tears rising before he could stop them, and he pulled Lily into a hug that lasted a long moment. Victoria watched the two of them together and understood finally and completely that Caleb hadn't simply protected her daughter during one frightening storm months earlier. He'd given Lily something Victoria had, without meaning to, failed to provide consistently enough herself. Someone who would slow down entirely, without hesitation, the moment Lily needed someone to stay. Months later, Caleb officially stepped away from his janitor position to run his growing educational media studio full-time. Though he continued visiting the school regularly, unwilling to fully let go of the place where all of this had started. Victoria's company eventually launched a partnership funding creative learning programs across local schools. Not because Caleb had ever asked her to, but because she'd genuinely come to understand, through months of watching him work, that success meant considerably more when it reached the people who rarely received any attention at all. The first program launched in the very school where it had all begun, funding a small workshop space where students could learn, alongside Caleb, how to look at something broken and see a beginning instead of an ending. Victoria attended the opening quietly, refusing any press coverage, standing near the back of the room, while Lily proudly gave the other children a tour of the space, as though she'd built it herself. Her relationship with Caleb developed slowly, without rush, without any single dramatic turning point. Trust came first, then an easy, comfortable friendship. Then, gradually, the quiet realization that both of them had started looking for the other whenever anything important happened in their lives, good or difficult. One evening, after Lily's school performance, Victoria found Caleb waiting outside, beneath an umbrella, rain falling softly around them both. She smiled, recognizing it immediately. "You still carry that thing?" Caleb looked down at the umbrella in his hand. The same one, small and slightly mismatched from its long-ago repair, that he'd fixed for a frightened 5-year-old during a storm that had changed the shape of all three of their lives. "Some things are worth fixing," he said. Victoria studied him a long moment, something warm and certain settling behind her eyes. "And some are worth keeping." Caleb smiled. Lily came running between them a moment later, grabbing both their hands at once, pulling them toward the car with the boundless energy of a child, utterly unbothered by rain. They didn't need to. The little girl who had once stood alone beneath a bus shelter, soaked and frightened and certain her mother was coming, had slowly, quietly become the reason three very different lives had finally found their way toward one another. And years later, whenever Lily heard rain against a window, she no longer remembered being lost. She remembered the man who had stopped everything, followed her through the storm, and made absolutely certain she never had to feel alone again. If this story reminded you that the smallest acts of kindness often build the biggest families, share it with someone who needs that reminder today. Leave it a like, and stay a little longer. There's always another story worth telling.